Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and today on Unplanned, we're going to talk about a subject that I think has been on everybody's mind for the past few months, and everybody's had to figure out one way or another. That question is, when COVID happened, how did you spend so much time indoors and not go completely insane? Well, today we're going to get a very interesting answer from a guy who lives not far from where I am, is a lawyer by day, but is a beer brewer by night. That person is Jimmy Venning. And Jimmy, I want to welcome you to Unplanned. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So Jimmy, I've already mentioned that you're a beer brewer, and I've already mentioned that the question we're trying to answer is how did people survive COVID here in Massachusetts? We recognize it's happening elsewhere in the country right now in lots of terrible ways, but how did they spend so much time and not go completely insane? Before we delve too far into that, why don't you just give us a little bit of background about yourself? Who are you?
Sure. Originally from Massachusetts. Went to school in Vermont, spent some time in DC. You mentioned practicing as a lawyer. I work in tax law. When I'm not working, I picked up brewing when I was in law school. I started picking up brewing beer and started with kits that you can buy that kind of have all the ingredients already set up, much like, you'd find a bread kit. And then as I gained some confidence, I started venturing out from that and got into all grain brewing and kind of writing some of my own recipes. And it's kind of a fun thing to be able to have beer at the end of the day and know that you made it, or go to a party or have people over and have it be your beer that people are drinking.
Well, that's very cool. I get the sense that brewing beer is I don't know if you'd call it a hobby or a practice that people really get into, a little bit like baking bread, maybe. I should add that when we first talked about doing this Unplanned, this episode of Unplanned, we were both joking about a book that was very popular when I was a young child, really, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I always thought it would be funny or fun to talk about this as Zen and the Art of Beer Brewing. As it turns out, I think I'm accurate in saying neither one of us has read the book. I know I've never read the book.
I haven't either. I should have done some research on that, at least.
That's okay. Well, I should have too, but we'll make do with what we've got. Now, tell me, so what were those first days of brewing like? Help us understand what beer brewing is all about.
So beer brewing is a really complicated process that tends to steer you in the right direction. If you have the right ingredients and the right equipment, beer kind of wants to make itself. You'll hear all these horror stories about beer getting funked or bacteria in it or whatever, but I either luckily or by being precise in the process haven't had any of that happen. And if you set it up well, what you create wants to be beer. So early on, I was using basically beer ingredients in a box, and kind of as I was standing over the stove, reading websites on, is it supposed to look like this and smell like this? And, in the end, the metrics will come off a little bit from what they tell you, but you've got a beer and it's a lot closer to the thing that you can buy on the shelf than you'd expect.
So can you give us a very brief overview of what in fact is the process of brewing beer? Brewers obviously know what it is, but for the rest of us, we haven't got a clue. We love the idea and we love drinking people's home brew, but we don't really know. So how would you describe it for the layman, for the layperson?
Sure. So it's basically a process of making really sugary water that's balanced against bitterness. And so you bring, 4 or 5 gallons. If you're making a 5-gallon batch, you bring 4 or 5 gallons up to 150 degrees, put your grain in. And so whatever you've determined, if it's dark beer, you've got more chocolate malt. If it's light, you'll have more Pilsen or 2-row. And you let it sit for about an hour. And that's like letting everything break down, letting the sugars seep out into the water. And so you get a pretty sweet um, mixture there. And then you sprinkle water over it afterwards, make sure everything like lets off. Um, and then you take that and put it on back on the stove and boil it for about an hour. And while you're boiling, you're dropping in hops at specific times. The earlier in on the boil, the more the alpha acids can come out and kind of impact the bitterness of your beer. And if you add them at the end of the boil, they aren't extracted, and so you just get the aroma, like that piney smell or fruity smell, not so much bitterness.
So if a hop, is it a hop or a hops is in the mixture for longer, it's got more, it's a hoppier beer, meaning but that to me is a slightly more bitter taste to it. Is that correct or?
Well, so saying hoppiness is difficult because you can have kind of two sides to that coin. You can have the bitterness, which is like alpha acids, or you can have the scent that people associate with the hop. So if you add a lot in later, you still have a hoppy beer that just wouldn't be as bitter. But if you add them in early, you are emphasizing the bitterness.
So let's go back. Let's jump back to the book neither one of us has read, which is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. What would you say? Because I get the impression that baking bread. Somebody once said to me a long time ago that beer is just basically liquid bread, and I've always associated the two things in my brain.
Yeah.
There's a sort of a zen to baking bread, and I get the feeling there's a sort of zen, whatever that means, to brewing beer. First of all, is that fair? Is that accurate? And if so, what is it about brewing beer that makes it that way?
I think so. I think that assessment is right. Like you go through this process, and then at the end of the day, just toss yeast into your 5-gallon vat, and then you close it up and let it sit for at least 2 weeks. And when you toss it in and close it, it's on its way or it isn't. And you kind of just have to like sit back and let it go about its way. There are tweaks that you can make, like you can do barrel aging or maybe add some vanilla at the end, but at that point it will be beer or it won't be beer. And so you kind of just have to accept that. And there's no management of the process in between.
Well, let's spend a minute, first of all, on types of beers, because there are lots of different types of beers. Again, I'm pretty uninformed, but I know that. And then there are a lot of home brewers out there. Well, I call them home brewers, but let's call them more accurately microbrewers who are producing lots of different variations on these things. What are some basic types of beer that people should be aware of?
So I think the two biggest categories would be ale and lager.
And what's the difference between those two?
So
that's a great question. What is the difference between those two?
difference? So generally, you'll find that lagers are lighter, ales are darker, but they do have some overlap in the middle. But the main difference is the temperature at which they're fermented. Ales being higher and lagers being colder. So lagers tend to be like a cellar ferment. And then I guess stouts are kind of on their own out there. So I've heard arguments that they're not quite an ale, so they are their own thing.
All right, so let's spend a minute on COVID, and I am curious. I imagine, or I certainly believe that brewing helped you get through COVID, and not just because you had beer in the house, but because it was something fun to do. Is that true? Was brewing a part of getting through COVID?
I think it was. Part of the adjustment to not really leaving the house all that much and not having weekend activities that weren't cleaning really helped the adjustment. And the brewing process takes, I guess the fastest you could probably do it is 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours. And it can get stretched out from there as you want to get more complicated. But so it's, an accomplished Saturday or Sunday that really makes you feel like you did something on the weekend, even though you only ran between the kitchen and bathroom.
Now, it turns out you have shared with us here on Unplanned a beer that you've made. Is that correct?
Yes.
So should we take a look? Let's take a look at what we've got here. So I have something with a purple top. I don't know if people can see that, but I have a purple top. Yes, I can see it very clearly on yours. What is this beer? What is this that you're sharing with us?
This is a gruit that we brewed about a month ago, month and a half ago.
And what is a gruit? And what is a gruit?
So a gruit is a really old style of beer that predates the use of hops in beer.
Really?
Realize that
I'm opening mine right now. So predates hops. So yeah, tell us a little bit more. Give us a little bit more. And we're going to try this. I don't know if people can see. I have my my cheer up cup. Oh, and I'm spilling. I'm spilling beer. I'm spilling beer. It's okay. I'm inaugurating. I'm inaugurating unplanned with some gruit. But anyway, go on. Tell us about gruit.
So gruits, I think, originated in the 10th century.
Okay.
And they are basically, instead of hops, like you were mentioning earlier, they use like bittering roots to balance the sweetness of all the malts. So they use sweet gale, and mugwort, and licorice root, wormwood, and then occasionally juniper as well. So it's really in like an herbal assortment that's meant to balance out the sweetness. And
that's amazing.
It was
what part of the world was that happening in? Is that European? Where is that happening?
Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium, I believe, is where it really started. And it was a way, those herbs were only grown in certain areas, so the herbs themselves could be taxed rather than the beer. So it kind of was a natural pinch point for taxation. And then as hops came in, those could grow anywhere. They were basically a weed, and so the church or the state went from taxing the herbs to taxing barrels.
That's fascinating. Is that something you learn as a tax lawyer, or is that something you learn as a beer brewer?
That was more beer brewing. That was curiosity as to what I was getting into, because it can be interesting brewing some older beers, because they're not consistent really with what you'd expect for other beer you try these days.
Yeah. So should we try this? All right. So what should I expect as I take a sip of this?
Should I warn you?
Oh, is it going to have a funky, interesting taste?
It's not that bad.
Okay, let's try it. Oh, it's good. It's really good. It's very smooth. I thought it might be. So I've had saison beers, which are interesting beers. Remind me what a saison is.
So a saison is basically a French farming beer. The farmers would brew it in the winter, and they would have it in the summer for when they had a lot of laborers on the farm, basically, and it would be part of their payment to their workers.
Was the beer?
Yeah.
And was it like day payment, like while they're out in the fields they get some saison, or do they?
I'm not sure if it went like that. Although I realized people drank a lot more during the day back then, so quite possibly.
What's one piece of advice you'd give to somebody who's thinking about brewing for the first time, who's never brewed before, really doesn't know what's involved? What would you tell them?
So I think the Zen part earlier would be pretty helpful. Like you try to set up this process that you control and that you keep sanitary the entire time, and you hit specific temperatures. But if you mess up, just keep going. Like if you drop an unsanitized spoon into the mash, it will be okay. If you miss the temperature by 5 degrees, it'll still be beer. So just keep going. It may not be precisely what you were hoping for, but it'll still be beer.
Well, Jimmy, I want to thank you again for joining us on Unplanned, and thank you for sharing this absolutely delicious beer with us. Um, and I guess to your health, to everybody's health. I think we all need here in America, we need a toast to our health, I would say.